As we venture into 2025, Asia, a continent celebrated for its cultural richness, breathtaking landscapes and breakneck economic dynamism, finds itself at a critical crossroads. Three nations in particular loom large over both regional stability and global markets, their precarious positions sending shockwaves through supply chains, financial systems, and diplomatic ties. China, once the unassailable engine of world growth. Pakistan, a country long mired in cycles of debt and political turmoil. And Sri Lanka, a nation that just 2 years ago celebrated its agricultural and tourist booms, but now grapples with default. Each teeter on the brink. Yet these are far from the only cases of looming collapse. A host of other states, Myanmar under military rule, cyclone-battered Bangladesh, debt-strapped Bhutan, crisis-ridden Afghanistan, bankrupt Lebanon, flood-prone Laos and climate-imperiled Maldives join the list of 10 Asian countries whose very fabric is under existential threat. In this deep-dive exploration, we unpack the complex interplay of internal missteps and external shocks that have brought these nations to 2025's perilous precipice, examining how economic freefall, political upheaval, environmental disaster, and social fracture converge to create a perfect storm. Read on to understand why the fate of these 10 nations matters not only to their own citizens but to us all, and why their collapse could rewrite the map of Asia for decades to come. China's meteoric ascent from agrarian obscurity to global powerhouse defined the early 21st century. But as Beijing steers its massive economy into uncharted territory, the cracks beneath the facade show in stark relief. The real estate sector, long a pillar of growth, now accounts for nearly 30% of GDP and carries the weight of unsustainable credit. After property titans such as Evergrande and Country Garden staggered under mountains of debt, defaulting on loans that total in the hundreds of billions of dollars, millions of prospective homeowners faced frozen construction sites and evaporating equity. Local governments, too, have borrowed heavily against land sales to finance grand infrastructure projects. New rail lines, airports in second-tier cities, sponge cities to absorb floodwater, and now face mounting repayment deadlines with dwindling revenues. Although state banks have rolled out rescue packages and the People's Bank of China has cut interest rates, liquidity remains tight and consumer confidence is frayed. Compounding these woes is a demographic cliff that threatens to sap the economy's very lifeblood. The end of the one-child policy in 2016 failed to reverse decades of population decline. China's population shrank in 2022 for the first time in 60 years, and fertility rates remain below replacement. An aging workforce, now up to nearly 20% over age 65, strains pension systems and shrinks the pool of young consumers. Youth unemployment hovers ominously above 20% in urban centers. On the political front, President Xi Jinping's consolidation of power, eliminating term limits, suppressing dissent, enforcing draconian zero-COVID lockdowns, and tightening ideological controls over private enterprise, has unnerved both domestic entrepreneurs and foreign investors. Sporadic protests in late 2022 signaled widespread discontent over lockdown policies and youth unemployment, yet Chinese authorities have responded with stepped-up surveillance and public order measures, rather than economic liberalization. On the geopolitical stage, Beijing's assertiveness in the South China Sea, its uncompromising stance on Taiwan, and its heavy-handed security policies in Xinjiang and Hong Kong have driven wedges between China and both neighboring ASEAN countries and major Western economies. Trade restrictions, ongoing export controls on semiconductors, and scrutiny of Chinese tech firms in US and EU markets threaten to decouple critical sectors. If these tensions intensify, China's manufacturing juggernaut, so integral to global supply chains, risks being undermined, triggering cascading shocks in industries from electronics to automotive manufacturing worldwide. Pakistan's struggles stand as a cautionary tale of how political dysfunction, security challenges, and economic mismanagement confuse into a seemingly intractable crisis. With external debt exceeding $120 billion, more than half of its GDP, and repeated integer confrontations with the International Monetary Fund, Islamabad drifts from one bailout to the next without ever addressing the roots of fiscal imbalance. In 2024, headline inflation breached 30%, sending food and fuel prices skyrocketing and pushing an additional 10 million people below the poverty line. The rupee's persistent devaluation against the dollar forced the central bank to confront a currency crisis by hiking policy rates into double figures, further stifling private investment. At the same time, Pakistan's political landscape has convulsed. The ousting of former Prime Minister Imran Khan in a vote of no confidence sparked deep fractures within both civilian institutions and the military establishment, long accustomed to king-making. Successive caretaker administrations have struggled to forge stable coalitions, derailing policy continuity and roiling markets each time the political animal requires a new caretaker mandate. Accusations of corruption swirl around many senior figures, stoking public cynicism. Meanwhile, the military, still the ultimate arbiter of power, faces growing resentment for intervention in civilian affairs, from media censorship to influencing electoral outcomes. Overlaying these internal pressures is an intensifying security crisis. The Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan has resurged, staging cross-border attacks and emboldened by safe havens in the rugged tribal areas. Sporadic violence in Balochistan and retaliatory skirmishes with India along the line of control in Kashmir further drain government resources. Pakistan's vulnerability to climate shocks, most disastrously demonstrated by the 2022 floods that submerged one-third of the country, has brought repeated humanitarian emergencies, weakening agricultural output by up to 25% and imperiling food security for tens of millions. These national traumas have spurred waves of internal displacement, placing additional burdens on overstretched health and education systems. Sri Lanka's spectacular economic collapse in 2022, its first sovereign default in history, unfurled. Against a backdrop of soaring debt, dwindling foreign reserves, and a tourism sector brought to its knees by the Easter Sunday terrorist attacks and COVID-19 lockdowns. The island nation's debt-to-GDP ratio now exceeds 120%, with much of the burden owed to bilateral creditors such as China's Export-Import Bank and Western institutions alike. A $2.9 billion IMF standby arrangement brought temporary relief, but came tethered to austerity measures, fuel subsidy cuts, a steep tax reform program, and public sector wage freezes that have inflamed a populace already reeling from annual inflation above 40%. Political upheaval followed swiftly. Long-dominant Rajapaksa family members, accused of nepotism, corruption, and mismanagement, were swept from power by mass protests in mid-2022. Subsequent administrations have stumbled to implement the structural reforms demanded by lenders, while balancing the clamoring for social subsidies and wage increases. Ethnic tensions that date back to the civil war between Sinhalese and Tamil populations remain an undercurrent, threatening cohesion even as the political elite change faces. Tourism, once accounting for 12% of GDP, has limped back at only half its pre-pandemic revenues. Port and maritime ventures aimed at capturing belt and road traffic have been stalled by transparency investigations and cost overruns. Environmental concerns compound the misery. The destructive monsoon floods of 2021 and landslides in the central highlands killed hundreds and wiped out agricultural lands, deepening both humanitarian need and budgetary strain. As foreign exchange dwindles, Sri Lanka struggles to import fertilizer, fueling rice import dependence and eroding the livelihoods of paddy farmers. With no clear path to debt restructuring or investment inflows, Sri Lanka risks slipping into chronic stagnation, its democracy caught between competing economic vassalages. Myanmar's spiral into turmoil began with the military coup of February 2021, which overthrew the fragile democratically elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. Since then, the junta has responded to widespread civilian protest with ruthless violence, killing thousands and imprisoning tens of thousands more. Civil disobedience campaigns across the country paralyzed essential services. Healthcare workers, teachers, and civil servants largely refused to cooperate, leaving the shadow National Unity Government (NUG) to provide rudimentary governance. in liberated areas alongside ethnic armed organizations that never laid down arms. The economic implosion has been catastrophic. GDP contracted by over 18% in 2021, and capital flight accelerated as foreign investors and humanitarian agencies pulled out. The kyat plummeted by more than half against the dollar, driving hyperinflation for everyday goods. International sanctions, imposed by Western nations in response to human rights abuses, further crippled oil and gas exports. Even pre-coup, neighbors such as Thailand and China have limited engagement to avoid direct association with the junta, leaving Myanmar increasingly isolated. Humanitarian indicators paint a grisly tableau. UN estimates indicate over 2 million internally displaced persons, with entire townships reduced to tent camps as fighting spreads. Health facilities, once among the best in Southeast Asia, now face critical shortages of medicine, equipment, and personnel, as doctors and nurses risk arrest for treating wounded protesters. Food insecurity levels have reached famine-like proportions in contested regions, with malnutrition rates in children under 5 soaring above 30%. While Bhutan is often heralded as a global exemplar of gross national happiness, its economic foundations are far from secure. Hydropower exports to India, once the bedrock of government revenue, have faltered amid delays in dam construction, lower river flows linked to climate variability, and renegotiated power purchase agreements that favor buyers. As hydropower receipts dip from over 20% of GDP to barely 12%, the kingdom finds itself scrambling for new income streams. Dependence on Indian budgetary grants, amounting to nearly 40% of total public expenditure, exposes Bhutan to geopolitical vicissitudes in New Delhi, especially as India grapples with its own fiscal constraints. External debt now surpasses 120% of GDP, funding not only energy projects, but also ambitious road building through fragile mountain ecosystems. Deforestation and landslides accompanying these projects disrupt local agriculture, on which over 60% of Bhutanese households depend. Meanwhile, youth migration has soared. With limited domestic job prospects, educated graduates flood urban centers or seek employment abroad, leaving behind an aging rural workforce struggling to maintain subsistence farms. Since the Taliban seized Kabul in August 2021, Afghanistan has lurched backward into economic and social abyss. The abrupt cessation of foreign aid, once covering over 70% of government spending, plunged the public sector into chaos. Hospitals went unpaid, teachers stopped receiving salaries, and entire ministries ceased to function. Banking restrictions, imposed by the US, which froze roughly $9 billion in Afghan assets, left the central bank broke, unable to import fuel, medicine, or wheat to stave off famine. International humanitarian agencies warn that over 28 million Afghans, some 70% of the population, now require assistance, with child malnutrition rates doubling since 2021. The IMF and World Bank remain reluctant to engage, while the Taliban refuses to form an inclusive government or guarantee women's rights to education and employment. Meanwhile, the resurgence of ISIS Khorasan province and internal Taliban factionalism has fractured security, turning once bustling cities into shells and fueling waves of refugees toward neighboring Pakistan and Iran, reigniting regional strains. Lebanon's meltdown ranks among the severest modern economic disasters. Once the banking and commercial hub of the Levant, the nation watched its currency lose 98% of its value since 2019, obliterating life savings overnight. The catastrophic Beirut port blast of August 2020 accelerated both physical and psychological ruin, yet no meaningful reconstruction has taken place, thanks to entrenched political patronage. In political terms, Lebanon's sectarian power-sharing system has calcified into paralysis. Months-long deadlocks to elect a president, form a cabinet, and pass budgets have become routine. International creditors and Gulf states have conditioned billions in aid on anti-corruption measures and governance reform, demands perpetually rebuffed by the same coalition of entrenched elites. Meanwhile, Hezbollah's dominance in parliament, and its autonomous military arm ensure that any drastic reform agenda faces existential blockade. Public services, electricity, water, waste collection, ceased functioning. Schools shuttered. Hospitals ran out of fuel. A cholera outbreak in late 2022 underscored the public health disaster unfolding, while emigration swelled as skilled professionals sought refugee status abroad. Bangladesh, often hailed as a development success story thanks to its garment export, boom, now confronts a combination of headwinds that threaten to reverse decades of progress. Global competition has eroded profit margins in the ready-made garment sector, which still accounts for over 80% of export earnings. Cost pressures, from rising wages to compliance with environmental and labor standards, have made factory owners look to lower-cost rivals. At home, inflation at nearly 9% in 2024 has eroded the real incomes of millions of low-paid garment workers and smallholder farmers alike. Rapid urbanization, compounded by rural to Dhaka migration, has created mega-slums lacking basic sanitation. Meanwhile, repeated cyclones and the gradual erosion of embankments in the Ganges Delta have displaced millions, exacerbating food insecurity and fueling tensions in urban shelters. Politically, the Awami League government faces mounting protests over alleged election fraud and suppression of dissent, and the next national election promises to be one of the most polarizing in Bangladesh's history. Without swift diversification of its export base or meaningful climate adaptation funding, Bangladesh's remarkable growth model may well falter under the twin pressures of global market shifts and environmental catastrophe. Laos, often cast as Southeast Asia's last landlocked frontier, has willingly courted debt through China's Belt and Road Initiative to build grand hydropower and rail projects. This gamble has pushed public debt above 100% of GDP, with Laos borrowing heavily, often at commercial rates, to finance the Vientiane-Botan Railway and Nam Ngum Dam expansions. As power purchase agreements stall and electricity exports to Thailand and Vietnam wane amid regional oversupply, Laos struggles to service its loans. The environmental consequences of its infrastructure binge have been dire. Dam projects flood ancestral lands, displacing rural communities. Sedimentation and disrupted river flows decimate fisheries vital for village nutrition. Deforestation accelerates, imperiling biodiversity. Without debt restructuring or a sudden boom in tourism, still recovering from Malaysia's and Vietnam's own rebounds, Laos risks both fiscal insolvency and ecological collapse, with adjacent riparian states likewise affected downstream. Finally, the Indian Ocean's string of atolls, the Maldives, sits at the sharpest existential threshold of all. More than 80% of its islands rise less than 1 meter above high tide, making every spike in sea level an existential threat. Though its economy leans heavily on luxury tourism, generating over 30% of GDP, the industry is vulnerable not only to global demand shocks, but also to the bleaching of coral reefs and extreme weather exacerbated by climate change. A $1.5 billion debt loaded onto state coffers through international borrowing to build a new airport and resort infrastructure has pushed public debt beyond 100% of GDP, forcing the government into a cyclical dependence on Chinese and Indian bailouts. Politically, the Maldivian archipelago remains unstable. Allegations of election interference, human rights abuses against political opponents, and shifting foreign policy alignments between China and India have created a governance fog that undermines investor confidence. With no domestic natural resources to pivot toward, and with its geography literally being swallowed by the ocean, the Maldives stands as perhaps the most vivid emblem of an impending collapse, born equally of environmental inexorability and economic overreach. As 2025 unfolds, these 10 nations, China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Bhutan, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Bangladesh, Laos, and the Maldives, reveal how fragile the foundations of state stability can become when economic mismanagement, political dysfunction, and environmental extremes intersect. Their struggles underscore the intricate web of global interdependence. A factory shutdown in Shenzhen ripples through electronic supply chains. A debt default in Islamabad shakes emerging market investors. A tidal inundation in Malé threatens the very idea of a sovereign archipelago. Understanding these crises in depth not only illuminates Asia's fault lines, but also compels us to consider how resilient governance, sustainable economics, and adaptive societies can and must be in an era of accelerating uncertainty.